So I'm very pleased to welcome tonight's speaker, John Blewett. John is based in Silsden. He has spent 35 years working in higher education before he retired in 2017. And obviously, he is a Morris expert and he is editor of the Journal of William Morris Studies. And tonight he's going to talk to us about William Morris's work in and around Leeds and Bradford. So over to you, John.
Well, thank you very much. If I blow my nose or cough, it's because I am coming out of the flu, so please forgive. So, William Morris, probably best known as a flat pattern designer, 19th century polymath. He was probably best known in his own time as a poet, the author of the biggest poem in the English language at 44,000 words, The Earthly Paradise, and also now, particularly as one of the founding members of the British Arts and Crafts movement and the designer of a number of very well-known flat pattern designs, which were used for textiles, for wallpapers, and for carpets. He was also a very astute businessman. And in 1861, soon after leaving university, he established Morris and Company, or as it was then, Morris, Marshall and Faulkner and Company. And the company included Dante Gabriel Rossetti and the architect Philip Webb. They produced wallpapers, furniture, and particularly stained glass, which was a very successful early product line. Because of Morris's arts and crafts ideals, a lot of the stuff which he produced was very expensive. And the reason for this was that he wanted to use traditional techniques as far as possible and good sound materials. And it was as a reaction to the mass production of shoddy goods in the industrial capitalism, which he saw all around him as both degrading labor and also degrading the artifacts, the products, the utensils, and everything else which people needed. He railed against the shoddy and the makeshift because all the capitalists wanted to do was grind out profits for themselves. So his clients were normally very, very wealthy. This is Rounton Grange, designed by Philip Webb in the 1870s, and Morris and Company were employed to do a lot of the internal furnishings and fittings and wallpapers. These pictures are from Country Life, 1915. And it was famously when talking to the owner, the ironmaster, Sir Isaac Lothian Bell, that Morris came up with the very famous saying, "I spend my life ministering to the swinish luxury of the rich." So in a way, there's an inherent, or maybe a contradiction in what Morris did. So these photographs give you an indication of not just the clients, but also the look of Morris and Company. Rounton Grange is in North Yorkshire, but there were a number of houses in and around Bradford, normally owned by mill owners, designed by arts and crafts architects, including Richard Norman Shaw, and this is an advert from the Leeds Mercury, giving notice of a sale of Silverstone House, which included, amongst other things, bed linen,
43 Bradford
mattresses,
American.
bedsteads, silver plates, all sorts of things, including whiskey. And which means that a lot of the internal decoration, the interior decoration, which Morris and Company was responsible for in the Yorkshire region, as elsewhere, has disappeared. You can see it in a few places like Whitwick Manor and Emery Walker's house in Hammersmith, and the National Trust at Mount Grace Priory, which was also owned by Sir Isaac Lothian Bell, has restored some of the rooms with Morris and Company furnishings. You have Morris wallpaper here, recently reprinted, and a carpet which was taken from a Philip Webb house in Redcar. So that's Morris. But he didn't actually visit Leeds in person for some time. What we do see, though, is the stained glass. In a few places, this is still in situ. This is stained glass from Silsden House, the house which went up for sale in the 1880s and demolished in 1903. The stained glass, most of it is lost, but there are a couple of panes in New York, and there's one pane, I believe, at the Stained Glass Museum in Ely. Harden Grange, just outside of Bingley again, owned by a Bradford mill owner, also had Morris and Company stained glass. The designers were Morris, Burne-Jones, Rossetti, Ford Madox Brown, and others. And this is, you can see these stained glass windows at Cliff Castle in Keighley. You can also see Morris and stained glass in Bradford Cathedral, or what was at the time the Bradford Parish Church. This isn't the original configuration. The original configuration was changed in the late 50s when the chancel was remodelled. But you get an idea of what it looked like originally here. There's also an altar frontal designed by Morris, a very famous acanthus design, probably designed in the 1880s. And there's also fabrics at the cathedral, which were designed by his daughter May. These early stained glass commissions in the 1860s were produced as a result of specifications being sent to Morris and Company, and the designs been worked up and then produced in various places in London and then later installed. This is Brigg. This is a church in Brighouse, stained glass again, to be seen in Cliff Castle. And you will also find, and this is one of the few places where the stained glass is in situ, and this is Oakwood Hall, again just outside of Bingley. Oakwood Hall is now a hotel. And you will find stained glass, the odd stained glass window in many churches in Yorkshire, Cumbria, Northumberland, well, all over the country, really. Now, Morris didn't visit, apart from Mountain Grange, Yorkshire in this period. His first visit to Leeds, actually, was in 1879. And this was as a result of one of the companies he was using to produce textiles, namely the Hackman White Manufacturing Company, was slightly altering his tulip and lily design, and then selling it off separately to John Maples, who ran the Maples department store in London. Now, plagiarism in the 19th century was not unknown, and it was very difficult to police and for copyright to be enforced. Nonetheless, in 1879, Morris consulted lawyers and spent a week in Leeds doing so. As a result of his consultation with the lawyers, he then went with Charles Wardle to see Sir John Maples, and Maples wasn't terribly sort of interested or terribly sympathetic. He couldn't see what Morris was making all the fuss about. He thought that if he produces and makes money from Morris-style designs, that's all to the good and it will benefit Morris too. So he didn't get much joy with Maples. I now move on because around about this time, the late 1870s and early 1880s, Morris was becoming increasingly aware politically. Firstly, he was concerned about British foreign policy and what was then known as the Eastern Question. Then he was becoming increasingly concerned about the nature of industrial capitalism. And he felt that what was happening was that art and craft skills, the role of the artisan, was being totally undermined, and that labour was no longer had the capacity or the opportunity to itself be creative and for people to experience any joy or satisfaction from the work they did. And he felt that the only way really this could be changed would be to change the system. So in 1883, he became a socialist. He initially joined Henry Hyman's Democratic Federation, and then a result of an internal disagreement over the nature of leadership and, to some extent, policy, Morris and his followers split from the Democratic Federation to form the Socialist League. And this is a sort of photograph, I think, taken in Morris's back garden in Hammersmith, of Socialist League members. Fine group of revolutionaries, as you say. His first visit then as a socialist was in February 1884 to Bradford. He spoke at the Temperance Hall. And in this period, he was giving a number of lectures. At the Temperance Hall in 1884, he probably gave his most famous lecture of all, still in print, not just in various anthologies, but you can buy it as a small booklet, I think published by Penguin Press. Useful work versus useless toil. And it was here that he spoke about, and I'm going to try, I've got something here on the middle of my screen, so I can't actually read it. But he was basically talking about how the economic system as it is produces not just shoddy goods, but luxuries we don't need, cheap goods which flood the market. And that this creates, in effect, waste and great wealth for those who own the means of production, who own the factories, who own the mills. And relative and sometimes absolute poverty for those who work. What's more, and what's more important here, is that there was an absence in most cases of work which was actually enjoyable, actually satisfying, creative, valuable. The goods were ugly, the goods fell apart, they were not durable. And it was around about this time that Morris came up with that famous sentence, have nothing in your houses that are not either beautiful or useful. He wrote to his wife soon after. The Bradford lecture went off very well. A full house and all that. But they are mostly a sad set of Philistines there, and it will be long before we do anything with them. You see, the workmen are pretty comfortable there because all the spinning and weaving is done by women and children. The latter go to the mill at 10 years old for 5 hours a day as half-timers. I don't think all my vigorous words, of a nature that you may imagine, shook the conviction of my entertainers that this was the way to make an earthly paradise. However, when he was talking about the workmen, he was talking about what were known as the labour aristocrats, the artisans who were doing pretty well, maybe earning £2 a week or so, or more, in fact. And among the audience were a number of people who did actually listen and were taken by Morris's words. And Morris's words stayed with them for the rest of their lives. One of these people was Fred Jowett, who would quickly, with others, set up a branch of Morris's Socialist League in Bradford and would be a founder member and a prominent figure in the Independent Labour Party, both in the West Riding and nationally. And in 1926, he produced a pamphlet called What Made Me a Socialist for the Independent Labour Party. And in this, he recalled the effect of hearing Morris's words and reading Morris's literature. There was a workmate of mine at that time who couldn't read. He was nevertheless very much alive and interested in political questions. He worked in a part of the factory in which there was no machinery, and at a job which for hours kept his fingers busy, twisting threads together in oft-repeated motion. All the time he could think and talk of other things than his work. I carried my socialist pamphlets. I imagine it would be useful work versus useless toil, about with me and read them to him in spare intervals, a few pages at a time. The same with the Commonweal and other literature. He became as keen as I was myself, and the process of reading and explaining deepened my own convictions. We talked at mealtimes to other men. And one of the things which virtually everybody read who became active in the Independent Labour Party and in the Socialist League before that was News from Nowhere. His utopian novel, first published in Commonweal, the political journal which Morris edited for some time. A Dream of John Ball was another one of Morris's political novels, utopian novels, which they read. And also Chants for Socialists, poems which would be sung to well-known songs, whether it's Down Amongst the Dead Men or John Brown's Body, which was the song which went along with March of the Workers. He again spoke in the Temperance Hall in 1886. This time he lectured on socialism. The aim of socialism is to make the best by man's effort of the chances of happiness which the life of man upon the earth offers us, using the word happiness in its deepest sense, to assure to everyone born into the world. I can't see that either. Anyway, his first talk was just a couple of months later. First talk in Leeds was just a couple of months later to the Leeds Philosophical and Literary Society at the Philosophical Hall. It was widely reported in the Leeds press, and the day after his talk, there was a short piece in the Leeds Mercury. The day after were 2 whole columns going into Morris's talk. However, the Leeds Mercury wasn't terribly taken with what Morris was saying. But it is impossible to refrain from an expression of regret that Mr. Morris, addressing a not inconsiderable number of persons who had a practical acquaintance with the relations of rich and poor in a great commercial town, some of whom indeed belonged to the order of profit grinders, as he calls them, whilst others were among the alleged victims of that class, should have displayed so small an amount of knowledge of the question which he discussed. And it was here, in this lecture, The Relation of Art to Labour, which was delivered a number of times with the shortened title of Art and Labour, that Morris spoke about really the history of art in terms of the way it was produced through the various periods from the ancient Greeks to the present. And he said that in the Middle Ages, produced beauty is a necessary part of the goods, so that an approximation to the ideal of creating beauty was realized in every product. He was the master of his work, master of his tools, master of his time. And this was important to that. The workman should own these things, should be able to regulate his own labor. That was now, he said, gone. There should be no society outside those who work to sustain society. Labor, creative work, was important, not only to Morris personally, but he felt it would be important to any future society, but not work of any description. The work where the artist and the craftsman and the designer were all one and the same. Morris spoke again in Leeds in 1886. He spoke at the Assembly Rooms in Leeds, which was a sort of major venue of the time. And Alf Mattison, who was just a young man of 18 at the time, and became a member of the Socialist League in Leeds, and then a very active and prominent member in the Leeds Independent Labour Party, was there. Some decades later, he produced his memories of this period in a series of notebooks. 18 there are in the Leeds Central Library of his time in the Independent Labour Party, as well as his time afterwards, after his active period, in the Kelmscott Fellowship, which was William Morris Appreciation Society, and keeping cuttings of what was going on in the 20s and 30s, particularly with the formation of the first 2 Labour governments. He said there was a big risk in hiring the Grand Assembly Rooms. It was expensive, needed a lot of advertising. But he regrets, he said, that the audience was not as large as he liked. Afterwards, they went with Morris to a little room they had also hired, and they had a general conversation. And Morris reflected upon the fact that a lot of the people who came and to talk to him were very young. And he said that this would be a hopeful augury for the movement. Although he was now in his well into his 50s and probably feeling his age quite a bit from a very strenuous schedule, and also suffering from a number of afflictions, notably gout, that he often referred to himself as an old man. So this experience of seeing a lot of young people was really important. What he also said in Leeds was that he really couldn't hope much from Parliament. Parliament itself is a sham. It was not made for the people. It was full of landlords and capitalists. The real struggle for socialism, he said, will not be in Parliament. It will be outside it. So Morris, in this period, strenuously advocated what was known as a policy of abstention. That is to say, what was important was to make socialists outside of the electoral process through agitation and propaganda. Elections could be used, he said, as part of the propaganda struggle, but don't expect too much from Parliament or indeed even from sort of local government, though he was to modify these views somewhat after the reform of local government, particularly with the LCC. In Commonweal, he reported on his time in Leeds, and he noted, "On Monday, I lectured in Leeds and found the audience rather heavy to spring, partly perhaps because though there were a great many people present, over 600 I should think, the hall was too large for the audience, who were, however, very attentive at least, and cheered heartily at the necessary expulsion of one gentleman, said to be an employer of Labour, who, or rather the alcohol in whom, tried to prevent my being heard. Once more, those who really wanted to ask questions were prevented by vague or cavilling speeches quite outside the four corners of the lecture." So the propaganda went on in Leeds and in Bradford, in Birmingham and in London and elsewhere. This is from the Madison collection at the Brotherton in Leeds. A number of lectures given, discussions given, meetings held. This one in St James's Cafe in Briggate. Sometimes there would be a member of the Socialist League reading out something written by Morris, as you see here, Misery in the Way Out, by Matt Sollitt, who was I believe, an anarchist, but nevertheless, at this time, a member of the Socialist League. The other important figure you see on this slide is actually Tom Maguire. Well, there are two. John Lincoln Mahon above and Tom Maguire below. Tom Maguire was a young man. His family was Irish. He worked as a photographer's assistant. He was very, very active propagandist and organizer. for the Socialist League and later for the Independent Labour Party. He was also a writer of short stories and poems. And in 1894, he contributed a short story to a booklet called Hypnotic Leeds, published in 1894 and edited by the journalist Albert T. Miles. Here, in a way, you see him maybe referring to Morris, certainly the utopia of philosophers, he says here. I've seen a twopenny pie given to a half-starved little chap, which, after it was initialed by the recipient's first bite, had a look in at 5 other hungry maws before it finally disappeared. Thus, the common law of gutter sparrows becomes the utopia of philosophers. It's the sharing of what is there, which Maguire is pointing out. He actually writes quite beautifully. But there were problems with all this propaganda. They were beginning to, the agitators, the speakers, of which there were quite a few, not huge numbers, but nevertheless quite a few, talking on street corners, at Vicar's Croft, in parks. Sometimes there would be joint meetings with the Socialist League in Bradford. Sometimes I felt this was, more than an uphill struggle. And in 1887, really quite early, only a couple of years after joining the League, Maguire felt that it was important really to establish a political party, a socialist Labour Party, he says, in Leeds, which will contest elections and make a difference. It would be more than simply an agitation and propaganda outfit. It would try and do some practical things which would help establish the cooperative Commonwealth. Commonweal, which is generally credited to be one of the best of the socialist journals of the 1880s and 1890s, was nonetheless a difficult sell. And Tom Paller, who's the secretary of the Socialist League at this time, wrote to the Socialist League headquarters in London, saying that it's becoming a dead failure, a millstone round our neck. We don't really sell enough, to warrant the expense or the effort. We'll continue to do our best, but we're not going to take any more. And it's certainly an interesting read, but if you're working 12, 14 hours a day, if you have very minimal education and just a basic functional literacy, it's going to be tough. It wasn't really there. Another active person in Leeds, briefly, was John Lincoln Mahon. Became active both in the Socialist League, in this case, firstly as the secretary to the national movement based in London, and then in Leeds. And Mahon produced, in 1888, a Labour programme. And he noted that what the electoral system was really doing is just sending people into Parliament and under councils who were landlords and lawyers and bankers. And the consequence of that is that they do things basically for themselves. They will improve the streets and clean up the mess, particularly around their businesses. But basically, the rest of the city would be left a slum. So he advocated a political party too. And the things which he said that the political party should do nationally and locally would later become the foundation for the Independent Labour Party. Some of the things he advocated were things like payment of MPs, payment of election expenses, public payment for election expenses, which would enable working people or working men at this time to be able to stand for election and, if elected, be able to sustain themselves. He talked about the need to socialise the gas, water, transport facilities. And he said that the slum areas should be demolished and the debris of the slums be given back to the landlords as their compensation, and public housing erected in their place. But it wasn't the propaganda which actually led to the formation of the Independent Labour Party in Bradford or anywhere else, but industrial action. The Manningham Mills dispute, late 1890, 1891, lasted around about 20 weeks. It was the result of wage cuts. Samuel Cunliffe Lister said it was necessary in order to remain competitive. He said that he pays good wages. He's a big wage and he makes a big profit. That's how it should be. In fact, he pays wages which are twice the amount paid in Germany. And it was pointed out to him in a newspaper and a letter to the Bradford Observer that this was not the case. In Germany, they pay more than he does. But this was quite an important dispute because for the first time, I think, for many people, it was seen as a conflict of classes rather than simply workers attempting to improve their condition. The operatives have, from the first, the Yorkshire Factory Times noted, been fought not only by their own employers at Manningham, but by the whole money class of Bradford, from the highest dignitary down to the lowest corporate officer. Law and order has been against them. The tactics employed by directors, police, and corporate authorities are simple lessons taken by the men on authority from previous disputes, and such underhand work, such pandering to the interest of their own class, will always prevail as long as men are placed on authority who care more for the interest of the rich than they do for that of the poor. This dispute resulted at first in the establishment of the Bradford Labour Union. There were labour unions in the Cone Valley and elsewhere. And eventually the Independent Labour Party, which was formed on a national basis in January 1893. And it met, the founding conference was in Bradford. And as Fred Jowett said in the Clarion newspaper, a socialist newspaper some years later, what was really important was to influence the stream of working class life. And that in order to do that, socialists in the Independent Labour Party had to be in it and not merely calling to it from the outside. So to be in it, to be relevant to the people of Leeds and Bradford and elsewhere, the working class people of Leeds and Bradford elsewhere, what was important was to have a programme of reforms, not simple ameliorative reforms which would keep the system going, but reforms which would show working people that socialism could make a difference. D.B. Foster, a Christian socialist, member of the Leeds ILP and later Lord Mayor of Bradford, wrote a pamphlet called Leeds Slumdom. He paid for it himself, as well as wrote it, and hired a professional photographer by the name of Swift to illustrate it. And it was the pictures which I think for many people, certainly for Alfred Orage, who was writing in the ILP paper, Labour leader, that really had a serious impact. If the sight at second hand of these horrors is not enough to convince worthy citizens that they are not yet living in heaven, I don't know what will. Slum conditions in Leeds. This is a picture produced by the city engineers in 1901. There were also pictures produced in Bradford by the planning officer, I think a chap called Arthur Saul. Those pictures haven't been catalogued, and they're not available at the moment. But what ILP people found campaigning in these areas was that they were pretty unresponsive unless they could see changes which would improve their lives. Edward Hartley, a leading figure in the Bradford ILP, wrote in the Bradford Labour Echo in 1895, the people were bitter, intolerant, unsympathetic and insolent, prone to live on charity rather than on the rights of manhood and womanhood. Not until the death rate, the insanitation and the horrible mode of life are changed shall we ever see the southward of Bradford taking an intelligent interest in the things mostly concerning them. Fred Jowett, elected to the council in 1892 and then to Parliament in 1906, went around the area talking about effectively municipal socialism, the socialisation of the land, the socialisation of transport, of housing, and so on. This is the ILP Journal for Keighley, 1894. He spoke at least twice in Keighley. And you'll see in these local ILP journals quotations from sort of a number of leading literary figures, including William Morris. And a couple of months later, 25th of March, 1894, this is one of William Morris's socialist charms. As a councillor and then alderman, Jowett worked strenuously to improve the lot of working people in Bradford. He wrote a short booklet called Socialist in the City. He fought the Liberal and the Conservative members on the council who opposed the demolition of some slums. This is in the Longlands area in Bradford, and the construction of council housing. Faxley. He worked closely with Bradford's chief medical officer, W. Arnold Evans, who would write every year a report on the health of Bradford. And he noted that in this area, the Longlands area, which was mainly consisted of back-to-backs, which were shoddily built, which actually were a sore, insanitary. Tuberculosis was 5 times higher than anywhere else in the city. Diarrhea and dysentery was the major cause of death in this area, largely because of the insanitary conditions. There were no water closets, there were privy middens outside, which often leaked. Often women, instead of going outside to relieve themselves at night, would keep their excrement inside, and that would lead to all sorts of contaminations. Another thing he fought to improve the conditions of working people was to ensure that mill owners actually enforced regulations to combat anthrax. And certainly in the 1890s, anthrax was still a serious issue for the Walcombers, and would remain so for quite a long time, right into the 1920s. Smallpox was also another issue, and a fever hospital was built in Bradford, and Jowett and others insisted that there would be vaccination for all children. This is a picture from Leicester showing a boy who was not vaccinated and a boy who was. And then, as now, there were a number of anti-vax campaigns going around. The other thing which was really important was school meals. Children couldn't learn if they were hungry. And Jowett, along with Catherine St. John Conway and Margaret Macmillan, instituted the first ever school meal service. The first school, I think, was actually the head teacher for the first school which actually served school meals to poor children in Bradford was J.B. Priestley's father. Tom Maguire in Leeds was also part of this process in Leeds, but he died at a terribly young age, 29, in 1895. At his funeral, Alf Maddison would read a passage from William Morris's Dream of John Bull, and the 400 people who attended his funeral walked away at the end of the service singing the March of the Workers to the tune of John Brown by William Morris, who contributed £2 to the election expenses. Morris here, although by this time, at the end of his life, remained a keynote figure, a lodestone really for the ILP, someone who they would refer back to, activists would refer back to as sort of the true North. Catherine St. John Conway referred to News from Nowhere in her lecture and pamphlet, Cry of the Children. In his News from Nowhere, William Morris has felt so keenly the mockery of our present system of education that he scatters his children in the woods where he can learn to do things for themselves, and where they can learn to do things for themselves and get to notice the wild animals. The 5th chapter of his book is full of suggestion. This is a Leeds Board School from 1901, you see, in the moving image above. Isabella Ford, who Morris stayed with, who she shared a house with her sister Bessie, so Morris knew them. And Isabella Ford wrote in her pamphlet, Women and Socialism, socialism demands more than that we should merely import socialist institutions into our midst, such as free meals for children, municipalisation, etc., and consider that they will regenerate and turn us all into socialists. It insists on a moral regeneration of society of the most complete and searching kind in order to make a lasting foundation for the political and social changes where many of us long to see. So apart from changing the lives of people in a positive way, what was also important was that there should be a new socialist morality. And indeed, for many people in this period who were active socialists, socialism was not just like a religion, but in effect, a religion. And some of these active socialists had come from a nonconformist background, and in their speeches and pamphlets used a lot of terms which could have easily have been found in a nonconformist or heard in a nonconformist chapel. Late in life, Jowett spoke to his biographer, Fenner Brockway. He'd had problems with the Labour Party. He wouldn't toe the line. And he said that he was a revolutionarist, he said. He said he'd joined the Socialist League in 1886. We come before you as a body advocating the principles of revolutionary socialism. That is, we seek a change in the basis of society. He said what the Independent Labour Party wanted to do was what Morris wanted to do. Morally regenerate society, make the lives of people better. And the only way of doing that would be to change the basis of society. And if that was to be done incrementally, that was the way to do it. But there was an end in view, which was the millennium which Morris had outlined in News from Nowhere. And it was actually, I think, Ramsay MacDonald in 1936, just a year before his death. This is 5 years after the formation of the national government, talking about William Morris. He says, the men in the front line, Labour Party politicians and others, must draw refreshment from the cool wells of idealism, such as is found in the pages of William Morris. Those of us who try to be craftsmen in the fashioning of socialism will fail unless inspired by the life and work and ideals of William Morris. And very briefly, a coda. A craftsman, a medieval craftsman, probably in the guild. The Leeds Arts Club was formed in 1903, as you probably know. The object of the club is to affirm the mutual dependence of art and ideas. The separation of beauty from use or use from beauty is in the long run disastrous to both, and only their union and a single clear purpose can restore to us the value of either. To this end, it is necessary that real and enduring standards should be created anew, as well as in the public as in the individual mind, by means of which art and ideas may be judged in their intimate bearing on life. Two people who were instrumental in the formation of the Leeds Art Club was Alfred Orage and Albert Jackson. Both edited a new journal, The New Age, and Albert Jackson wrote a short book on Morris. In The New Age were articles published, written by S.G. Hobson, G.D.H. Cole, arguing for guild socialism, in effect, a revival of the guild idea of economic democracy, where workers in guilds would be able to work, to control their own work and produce what was necessary for society and benefit from their work directly without being exploited by capitalists. One of the first things the Leeds Art Club put on was an exhibition of Kelmscott Press books. So Morris, although by this time dead, his legacy continued as it did throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. So thank you.
Thank you, John, for a very interesting talk. Most enlightening and for sharing your knowledge with us. I'm just looking in the in the chat box. Um, no questions in yet. A few comments. Somebody saying that Janet Douglas would have loved the talk. Um, does anybody have any questions? If you do, please. I think unmute yourself and speak. Um, nobody's coming forward yet. I mean, I read somewhere that during his lifetime he was better known as a writer than for his design work.
Yes,
Um,
he was.
which
He was.
yeah,
Even in the 1890s, and he died in 1896. He was known as the author of the Earthly Paradise.
yeah,
And at one time, he was sounded out whether he would be the poet laureate after Tennyson died. He
gosh,
couldn't actually imagine himself writing odes to Queen Victoria and said, "No way do I want to do that." And his name was also mentioned in connection with the Oxford Chair of Poetry, which he also said he wasn't particularly interested in. Um,
yeah,
but his design work was important. But I think it's only in the 20th century that his designs became generally known, um, largely through machine manufacture rather than handicraft, which made them available to people on far more modest incomes than Sir Isaac Lothian Bell or the Bradford mill owners.
yeah, yeah. We've got lots of comments coming through now. Compliments. Um, somebody saying they like the AI image. It's nice to see the speaker up large at the same time as the slides.
Yes.
Um, and
Yes.
yeah, I mean it's the first
But
time
it
I've
might.
seen that. Uh, yeah, incredible. Um, lots of people saying, "Yeah, thank you very much, excellent." Uh, a very interesting man with insights and opinions which are relevant to today. Um, somebody says, did he member of Parliament? Did he become? I don't know what that means.
Well,
Well, he
Morris,
didn't become a MP, did he? It was
Morris,
long before.
no, Morris didn't become a member of Parliament. He was asked to stand for Parliament, actually by people who lived in a commune in the northeast of England, but he turned them down. And he was also asked by Robert Blatchford, who was the editor of the Clarion newspaper, which had a very large circulation for a socialist paper. Um, at one time, about 80,000. That he was asked to join the ILP and become prominent within that, and he turned that down too. Um, he did actually, in late in life, talk support George Lansbury, who would become who was at that time a member of the Social Democratic Federation, when he stood for Parliament for Woolworth in South London in 1895.
Yeah,
Lansbury would later join the ILP, and after MacDonald formed the national government in 1931, became leader of the Labour Party for 4 years.
yeah,
Um, but no, he didn't, and he he stayed personally true to his own beliefs.
yeah.
So
Okay. Somebody says, was he living at Kelmscott at the time he was traveling the country lecturing?
he lived his He had a London home called Kelmscott House, which is in Hammersmith on the river. Um, the house is now in private ownership, but the coach house, which is attached to it, is where the William Morris Society has its offices and has a small museum space.
Mhm.
He also had a lease on a house in Oxfordshire called Kelmscott Manor, which is now owned by the Society of Antiquaries. Um, and you can visit both the coach house in Hammersmith and Kelmscott Manor in Kelmscott near Letchlade in Oxfordshire. They're both
Yeah.
public.
I mean, he seems to have moved around an awful lot, I think, every sort of 5, 6, 7 years,
He
perhaps,
did,
and
he
then
did.
designing each place.
He did. But he was, he said he accepted that in a way that, London was so important to him because of his business. Um, so he lived in London or just outside most of his adult life, although he would go to Oxfordshire, for rest periods, um, you know, to get away from it. But Hammersmith at this time, the late 1870s to 1896 when he died, was still very much a sort of a suburb of London. Um, but it also meant that being in London, he had good train access to other parts of the country. So at this time, the
Yeah.
1880s, when he was really active for that 7 years, uh, promoting socialism, he would literally travel all over the country, England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. And he gave something like 2,000 lectures within 6 or 7 years.
Yeah. Gosh. Somebody said, was he interested in gardening?
He was interested in designing gardens,
Yes.
but he wasn't that really terribly keen on putting a spade in his hands and doing the digging. The only sort of practical activity he did was clip a hedge a large hedge he had in Kelmscott Manor in the shape of a dragon, because he was also, one of the things he was really interested in was Norse and Icelandic sagas, and they're full of dragons. So he created a dragon in his garden. But he had definite ideas about plants and planting and the way gardens should be laid out. And
Yeah.
these were basically based on his understanding and study of medieval gardens through the study
Yeah.
of medieval manuscripts.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I can't see any more questions coming through. No, nobody's unmuted. So I think another question has come through. Did he, like other thinkers and writers, have an American audience?
He did have an American audience in two ways. He had a commercial audience, and some of his books and some of his designs were ripped off in America too. But he also had an agent in Boston. Um, he was, like a lot of people, aware of the transcendentalists, particularly Thoreau, and I think he was less keen on Emerson. And I think he was also aware of and knew the work of Walt Whitman as well. But he was in contact with a lot of socialists in America, as he was socialist in other parts of the world, Europe, and particularly Australia, uh, where there was quite an active and well-organized labour movement. And I think the Labour Party in Australia formed the first federal government in 1904.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that, John. Fascinating and enlightening is the comment from Janet, and I think that sums it up. So we'll sign out now, I think.